There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a town when something unthinkable happens. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning or the gentle hush of snowfall, but a heavy, suffocating silence born from collective shock and fear. The kind where neighbors stop making eye contact, where children are kept indoors despite perfect weather, where every unfamiliar car driving down Main Street makes people peek through their curtains with suspicion. Delphi, Indiana, experienced that. Silence beginning on February 14, 2017, and in many ways that silence persisted for over 6 years. Welcome back to Crime Scout. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a murder case. It's the story of how 2 young girls went for a hike on a beautiful winter afternoon and never came home. How their deaths haunted an entire community, and how one of the most extensive investigations in Indiana history eventually led to an arrest that stunned everyone who thought they knew their neighbors. I'm talking about the Delphi murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German, a case that transformed a peaceful town of less than 3,000 people into a place where parents were terrified to let their children out of sight. If you've been following Crime Scout, you know we don't just cover crimes, we examine how they ripple through communities, how they change people, and how ordinary places become marked by tragedy. Make sure you're subscribed because cases like this one, they need to be told with the respect and depth they deserve. Let's talk about what happened in Delphi, and I warn you, some of these details are disturbing, but they're important to understand the full scope of this case. February 13th, 2017 started as an unseasonably warm winter day in Delphi, a small town in Carroll County, Indiana. School was out for a winter break, and 2 best friends, 14-year-old Liberty German, who everyone called Libby, and 13-year-old Abigail Williams, called Abby, decided to spend the afternoon outdoors. These girls were inseparable, the kind of best friends who finished each other's sentences and had inside jokes no one else understood. Libby was the tech-savvy one, always on her phone, taking photos and videos. Abby was athletic and outgoing. They were good kids from good families, involved in sports, doing well in school, exactly the kind of wholesome small-town teenagers you'd expect to find in a place like Delphi. That Monday afternoon, Libby's older sister Kelsey dropped the girls off at the Monon High Bridge Trail around 1:30 in the afternoon. This wasn't unusual. The Monon High Bridge is a local landmark, an abandoned railroad bridge that sits about 60 feet above Deer Creek. It's a popular hiking spot, especially for local teens. Kelsey agreed to pick them up later that afternoon. The girls set off on the trail, excited for an adventure on such a nice day. Libby was documenting their hike on her phone, taking pictures of the scenery, of Abby walking across the bridge. Just typical teenage stuff. The Monon High Bridge itself is pretty dramatic, over 800 feet long, with wooden planks that have gaps between them where you can see straight down to the creek below. Walking across it requires careful attention, but local kids had been doing it for years. Sometime around 2:30 p.m., something went terribly wrong. When Kelsey returned to pick up the girls at the agreed-upon time around 3:15 p.m., they weren't there. She tried calling Libby's phone but got no answer. Initially, she thought maybe they'd lost track of time or wandered further down the trail, but as minutes turned into an hour with no sign of them, real panic set in. By 5:30 p.m., both families were at the trail searching and calling the girls' names. By evening, it was a full search operation with law enforcement involved. Delphi Fire Department, Carroll County Sheriff's Office, and volunteers combed the trails with flashlights as darkness fell. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and everyone was desperately hoping the girls had just gotten lost or maybe one of them had been injured and they'd taken shelter somewhere. But experienced searchers knew the trails well, and the growing sense of dread was palpable. Where could 2 young girls have gone in such a small area? The next morning, February 14th, Valentine's Day, the search resumed at first light with even more volunteers, search and rescue teams, and investigators. Around noon, the worst fears were realized. The bodies of Abby Williams and Liberty German were found on private property about half a mile from the Monon High Bridge, on the north side of Deer Creek in a wooded area. They had been murdered. The details of their injuries weren't immediately released, and to this day, many specifics remain sealed to protect the investigation. But it was clear this was a homicide, and a particularly brutal one. The news spread through Delphi like wildfire. Two local girls, beloved by everyone who knew them, had been killed while hiking in broad daylight on a trail hundreds of people used regularly. If it could happen to Abby and Libby, it could happen to anyone's children. The fear was instant and overwhelming. Schools went into heightened security. Parents refused to let kids walk anywhere alone. The community was paralyzed. What happened next is what makes this case so unique and so frustrating. Investigators discovered that Libby German, in what can only be described as an act of incredible bravery and presence of mind, had recorded her killer on her phone. Law enforcement recovered Libby's phone from the crime scene, and on it they found photos and video that Libby had taken during the attack. One photo showed a man walking on the bridge behind the girls. The video, though brief, captured a man's voice saying, "Down the hill," in a commanding tone, and it also showed the man approaching. This was astonishing evidence. Here was actual video and audio of the suspect, recorded by one of the victims as the crime was happening. Libby German had provided investigators with perhaps the most valuable evidence possible, a literal recording of her murderer. On February 15th, just 2 days after the murders, Indiana State Police released the photo of the man on the bridge, asking the public for help identifying him. The image showed a white male wearing jeans, a blue jacket, and a hoodie, walking with his hands in his pockets. They also released the audio clip of "Down the Hill." The hope was that someone would recognize the voice or the appearance and come forward. The response was immediate and massive. Tips poured in by the thousands. The FBI joined the investigation. A task force was formed. Billboards with the suspect's image went up across Indiana and neighboring states. The case received national media attention. Everyone in Delphi and beyond was looking at that grainy photo, listening to that chilling audio, trying to figure out who this man was. The frustrating part was that the image wasn't clear enough for definitive identification. It could have been almost anyone. A somewhat heavy-set man in ordinary clothing. The voice on the audio was distinctive but brief, just 3 words. Still, investigators were confident that someone knew this person, that someone would recognize him and call in. But weeks turned into months, then into years, and despite thousands of tips and hundreds of people interviewed, no arrest was made. The case went cold in the most public and agonizing way possible. The families of Abby and Libby, especially. Libby's grandparents who had been raising her became advocates for the case, doing media interviews, organizing annual memorial walks, keeping the story alive. They created the Abby and Libby Memorial Park in Delphi. Every year on the anniversary, the community gathered to remember the girls and renew calls for justice. In April 2019, more than 2 years after the murders, Indiana State Police held a press conference that shocked everyone following the case. They released a new sketch of the suspect, one that looked dramatically different from the original sketch. This new image showed a younger-looking man, possibly in his 20s or 30s, with a fuller face. They also released additional audio from Libby's phone and a short video clip showing the suspect walking. Superintendent Doug Carter of the Indiana State Police made a direct appeal to the killer, saying, "We believe you are hiding in plain sight," and addressing him directly, suggesting he might be in the room or watching. It was an emotional and unusual press conference that made it clear investigators believed they were close to someone. But still, no arrest came. The change in the sketch and the new direction of the investigation caused confusion and frustration in the community. Who were they actually looking for? Why had the description changed so dramatically? Law enforcement explained that witness descriptions had evolved and that the new sketch was more accurate, but it didn't ease the anxiety. Then, in a separate bizarre twist, law enforcement announced they were looking into a potential connection to a man named James Chadwell, who had attacked and held captive a 9-year-old girl in Lafayette, Indiana, in April 2021. When police raided Chadwell's home during that investigation, people noticed he resembled the Delphi sketch, and his property had disturbing similarities to details known about the Delphi case. The internet exploded with speculation that Chadwell was the Delphi killer. However, law enforcement eventually stated publicly that Chadwell was not considered a suspect in the Delphi murders, though they hadn't completely ruled him out. It was another dead end that left the community frustrated and fearful. If the killer wasn't Chadwell, then who was it, and were they still living among them? The break finally came on October 26, 2022, more than 5.5 years after Abby and Libby were killed. Indiana State Police announced the arrest of 50-year-old Richard Allen of Delphi, Indiana, for the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. Richard Allen wasn't some drifter or stranger to the community. He was a local man who worked at the CVS pharmacy right on Main Street in Delphi, a place where people in the community, including possibly the girls' families, had shopped regularly for years. He had lived in Delphi since at least 2016, meaning he'd been there when the murders happened and had remained there throughout the entire investigation. He had a wife, no significant criminal history, and by all outward appearances was just a regular middle-aged guy working a normal job. The arrest sent shockwaves through Delphi that were almost as powerful as the original murders. People had been served by this man at the pharmacy, had casual conversations with him, had seen him around town for years, and all that time he was allegedly the person who had brutally murdered 2 young girls. The probable cause affidavit, when it was unsealed, revealed that Allen had actually been interviewed early in the investigation. He had come forward himself in 2017, just days after the murders, telling a conservation officer that he had been on the trails that day around the same time as the girls. Somehow, this interview wasn't properly filed or followed upon until years later when investigators were going back through old tips and leads. When they re-interviewed Allen in October 2022, his statements allegedly contained inconsistencies. Investigators executed a search warrant on his home and found significant evidence. According to court documents, forensic evidence linked Allen to the crime scene, and ballistics testing on a firearm found in Allen's home allegedly matched an unspent cartridge found at the scene between the girls' bodies. Even more damning, Allen allegedly made incriminating statements while in custody. The case against him appeared strong, though Allen pleaded not guilty and his defense attorneys argued the evidence was circumstantial. The trial was scheduled for 2023, but faced multiple delays due to legal motions, including Allen's. Attorneys being removed from the case temporarily and then reinstated after public outcry, creating even more drama and delay for the families desperately wanting resolution. As of the time I'm recording this, Richard Allen remains in custody, awaiting trial. The community of Delphi is still processing the revelation that the man accused of the most heinous crime in their town's history was someone who had been right there among them the entire time, someone they'd interacted with regularly, someone who seemed completely ordinary. That's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this entire case. The monster wasn't a stranger from outside their community. He was their neighbor, their pharmacist, someone who appeared normal and friendly while, allegedly, harboring the darkest secret imaginable. The impact on Delphi has been profound and lasting. The town's innocence was stolen on February 13, 2017, and it's never coming back. Parents in Delphi and communities everywhere now think twice before letting their children hike alone or trust that daylight and familiar places equal safety. The case has also highlighted how crucial it is to listen to young people, to teach them to trust their instincts, and to use technology wisely. Libby German's decision to record what was happening likely will be what brings her and Abby's killer to justice. That 14-year-old girl's courage and quick thinking in the face of unimaginable terror provided investigators with evidence that, years later, helped identify a suspect. She's a hero, and her memory, along with Abby's, deserves to be honored. Not just as victims, but as real young women who had dreams, families who loved them, and lives that mattered far beyond the horrible way they ended. The families of Abby and Libby have shown remarkable strength and grace throughout this ordeal, channeling their grief into advocacy and keeping their daughters' memories alive in positive ways. They deserve to see justice finally served. If this case has affected you, if you're thinking about those two girls and the community that lost them, please give this video a like and share it. Cases like this need attention, not for sensationalism, but because they remind us to stay vigilant, to protect our children, and to never give up seeking justice. Subscribe to Crime Scout if you haven't already, because we're committed to covering these stories with the depth and respect they deserve. Stay safe out there, everyone. Trust your instincts and look out for one another. This is Crime Scout, signing off.